Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. I'm going to start giving some instructions in Spanish. My name is Eloisa Melendez. I'm the lead planner for the Blue Ribbon panel on child care. Para las personas que quieren escuchar en español, ya pueden ir al botón que dice, es el globo que dice interpretation, y escoger Spanish. And if you'd like to listen in English, you don't have to click anything. For this meeting, we also have a Q&A button. So if you want to put your questions in there in English or in Spanish, you can do that. And as everyone can see, we are recording this meeting and it will be posted on the OEC website. And thank you so much to our interpreter, Sasha, for being here. Still letting some people in from the waiting room, but I think we can get started, Commissioner.
Great. Hi, everybody. So glad to be here with you and so glad you're here with us because we need you and we're interested in your opinion. And some of you on the call will recall Jean Rustici, who was a longtime early childhood advocate and one of my mentors. I see some smiles on the screen. And Jean used to say, just show me the money. The money is what tells you where we are and what your priorities are. And so we've saved the best for last here with the funding and cost work group. We're going to have some estimates to share with you and some early thoughts in the process. But this is very preliminary. You know, this is our start of the process about funding and costs. We're in a rapid time frame, and I see so many faces who've been on the other listening sessions. And just today we were meeting and talking about how the input is changing our approach, and we'll break out of these 4 work groups and into more of a prioritization thanks to your input. So we expect that you'll be helping us. The analysis that we'll go over tonight is preliminary and grounded in the data that we have. I say that because the data that we have is imperfect. And so folks have been taking the data we have, talking to experts, adapting, talking to some of you all, adapting, and we're still want to know if you think we should adapt more, but understand that we've done the best we can with the data we have. And one of the recommendations will surely be to improve our data system, to improve our whole system. So we want to continue to refine these recommendations for children, for their families, and for our provider community. So those are sort of my opening comments. Really big shout out. Thank you to the funding and cost work group who've worked so hard to get us here today. Here's how our agenda is going to go. We're going to do a brief assessment of the current state of ECE and share some preliminary estimates with you. Oh, thanks, Jen. We'll get the slideshow going. And then we're going to have breakout sessions. But for those of you who have participated in other ones, this is going to be a little different because we're going to have a couple of breaks for like 5 or 6 minutes for questions as we go after the state analysis and future investments estimates, so that's really top of mind because some of that information might be important to bring into the breakout groups. And we'll have some folks in each breakout group who've been working on this topic. Know that the panel is going to use the input and these recommendations to ask their own questions and adapt based on feedback to develop a strategic plan for the childcare system that works for families, providers, and children and Connecticut's economy. before I go on to the next slide, I just want to say that we know things are super challenging right now in the field. And we also know, I mean, Jean Rustici, I think, passed away 20 years ago. Many of us have been advocating for decades and haven't seen delivered what's been needed for the field, for children and families. So we need your feedback period to get this right. And that's why these sessions have been designed. That's why we have a panel of some early childhood folks and total outsiders. We need to think out of the box. And we've built in a lot of opportunities for feedback. So this certainly isn't the last one on this topic. And I think, as you all know, it's going to come down to funding and costs and how we leverage that for this plan to be successful. So after the breakout groups, then we'll come back and wrap up. Okay, next slide, Jen. Just really quickly, we are in the final, it's hard to believe because this is going so super fast, but how we've gotten through equity and access, workforce and quality systems, and now we're on funding and costs to get something delivered, a plan that's going to make a difference, delivered to the governor by December. You're going to see when you look at these issues that many of the issues in the first three work groups intersect with funding and costs. These are not separate. And then we're going to go through some of these recommendations with you today, really the recommendations, and they're the same ones we're going to bring to the Blue Ribbon panel on Thursday. And for those of you who haven't been engaged, there are parents, early childhood professionals, business leaders, school age childcare directors, higher ed professionals, public school leaders, and legislators. And then we'll get feedback from them. I think this is slide 4, Jen. This is slide 4. This is slide 4. Okay. So this is our timeline. And look, this time clearly it feels like we're more than halfway there. But the idea that this is our last work group and that we're much more than halfway there is just a sign that there's going to be this process with funding and costs. Then there'll be like a week of public feedback in September when we come down to preliminary recommendations. Not all the recommendations we've covered with you will make it to the next round. And so we'll want to hear from you. If you say, hey, you left out something super important, then we want to hear that from you. But today, I think, like, I can't say this enough. What we put out there today is preliminary. This is testing these out on you all and on the panel, and then responding to that opportunity. They have to be socialized. We're not at the stage yet of knowing exactly how these will be implemented. You'll see, I think, the way I see this, the stage we're at with the funding and cost recommendations is we're really at the setup phase. We have the data we need to know what the options are that are in front of us. So Julie Giaccone and Maggie Adair have been doing great work in this group, and Julie's gonna take you through the next slides. Thanks so much, Julie.
Thank you, Commissioner. So our goal as a work group is defined here, and that goal is to redesign the ECE, the Early Childhood Education Funding System, to maximize resources, address future child development and educational needs, enhance family access to care, and ensure equity and sustainability. So this goal is the baseline for recommendations that we're going to be walking through shortly. Next slide. So we've identified the following 3 key categories for our recommendations. One is the financial model and planning, which is funding uses. The next is maximizing current resources and funding strategies. So the funding uses sub-goal is to assess current system, and in order to assess current systems, in order to estimate future investment needs to inform the development of a 5-year plan. And then the maximizing current resources sub-goal is to develop strategies to support the maximum use and efficient blending of federal, state, and local funding. And the funding strategy sub-goal is to identify potentially significant business, philanthropy, and innovative funding strategies to contribute to ECE needs, and to advise on the funding and structure of the newly formed Early Childhood Education Fund. Next slide. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on these two slides, as these problems that are bulleted here are they've already been socialized. But to summarize these simply, the funding levels for ECE are just too low. And as a result, it's impacting access, affordability, quality, teacher pay, child outcomes, retention and recruitment of the workforce, especially for women. And next slide. So geographies such as DC and Canada have shown that strategic incremental investment can have positive educational results, as well as dramatically improved workforce participation, particularly among women. So Connecticut already has a strong foundation to build upon, and we're currently serving over 37,000 children through state-funded programs and Care for Kids. This is complemented by another 5,500 served by federal Head Start and over 15,000 in the public school system. So I think we're now on slide 9. So as you can see in this table, Connecticut has a robust mixed delivery system with many different types of providers: small, medium, and large centers, licensed family childcare, public schools, and in total, you'll see over 3,500 providers in Connecticut. Next slide. So to clarify, we are basing our assumptions about system supply of childcare seats or slots on the licensed capacity of a program. So this is different from the way we've described capacity in the past. Many of you may have listened to our presentations on the narrow cost analysis we did in 2021. Historically, we've used desired enrollment, which is a measure on enrolled seats plus vacancies, but additional diligence has revealed that licensed capacity is a more accurate measure. It's also in alignment with what other states are using for measurement and recommended by field experts. So we've really scrubbed the underlying data sets to be sure as possible about the distribution of seats across the different age groups. We cross-checked different data sources as well in order to do this, because we needed to calculate the licensed capacity numbers for preschoolers, and we needed to divide up the age group. So we needed to separate and tweeze out the 3s and the 4s versus school age. So the result is a system capacity of about 113,000. You can see at the bottom of that table there, it's over 113,000 total licensed capacity. We have about 93,000 for centers combined with FCCs. And we have roughly 21,000, which you can see in the chart, enrolled in schools, slots in schools. And I think I'm going to hand it over to Commissioner Bai.
Thanks, Julie. Just a little context setting here. I think as Commissioner, I have learned a lot over the past 5 years about the data we do and don't have. And during COVID, we were trying to track enrollment very closely. And then we had some outsiders do an analysis, and now we've had this process. I really feel like we want to hear from you about supply and demand, because that's important to hear what's happening on the ground. But I finally, after 5 years, feel like I have my hands around the scale of the enrollment challenge. And again, it's not perfect, but what we know now is that the data we've been relying on was not so accurate. And sometimes that would lead to assumptions that would make this all look completely undoable. And now we have our hands around what the real scale of the problem is, and even some overage, as you'll see in preschool here. And I just think it's important to say that. I am not certain, I still have my doubts, but if anything else, this has told us that we need a better system for parents and children. So we need to enter the 2023 era and have a better system to know what parent demand is and what accessible slots are there for families, and help make that match better. Everybody's been doing their very best, but we know that this Blue Ribbon panel needs to make recommendations around that, because we know that knowing where spaces are available helps programs survive too, by helping them with enrollment. So just wanted to make that point. Next slide, Jen. Slide 11. Is this slide 11?
Yes.
Oh, Julie and I are on the same slide. Okay. So I'm just going to add a little more context to this slide then for you. What we did was we estimated preschool demand at 66%. And that's really in line with other geographies that have accessible, affordable, universal preschool. And so that is the number that we've had. This is a decrease from the past, but is pretty consistent with the kids count data that suggests that about 61% of the state's 3 and 4-year-olds are in preschool. And that number may sound low to you, but remember, we're saying 3 and 4-year-olds. So that's different than kids entering kindergarten with some preschool. Older data has suggested about 71%. Even if we went to 71%, it doesn't have a real large material difference here. We do know from SDE data that 79% of Connecticut children are reported by parents to have entered kindergarten with preschool, but we know there are wide disparities. In Alliance districts, this is 71%, and non-Alliance districts, 88%. That is a huge gap because of what we know about the importance of the early years. The other thing that's really different, because when I started, I inherited a report that said Connecticut was short 50,000 infant toddler spaces. Now there have been tiny adjustments in the number of infant and toddler spaces, but we are estimating that at 44.2%. And some of that is really based on the work done by the Bipartisan Policy Center, which is showing that just about 50% of parents are looking for formal care for their children, for the very young children, based on their research. And also, this is what we're seeing in other geographies where it's more accessible. And in Connecticut, we take that 50% and reduce it based on the 12 weeks of paid family leave. You might remember, those of you involved with that fight, that the average mother in Connecticut was going back to work after 4 weeks. That's really changed with the paid family leave. So that's different. And then you can see the gap in supply versus demand for both infant toddler, and then you can see the surplus of preschool supply. But it's important to note that for both infant toddler and preschool, some towns have more supply than they have preschoolers, and some have more supply than they have infants and toddlers. When you take those towns out, the numbers change a bit. So like, for example, in the infant and toddler, actually, I think it goes to 14,000 that need, if you just take out the towns with the surplus and just look at the towns, that goes to 14,000. So this just really, I think the supply and demand is important for us to understand. The surplus in preschool slots may be surprising for some of you, probably not for others who've been having challenges attracting preschoolers to your programs. But there's really a ton of variation among the towns. And so we really have to keep that in mind. It's not that we don't need to support any more preschool classrooms, because they're not all in the right places. So just also to say that if we changed the assumption to 71% instead of 66% with preschool, that 26,000 would still go to 22,000. So there's still a significant surplus. I saw there's a question in the chat from Alex, but I'll get through these, Alex, because we're close to stopping, and then we'll get to that. Next slide. Okay, now is the time to stop, right? If I'm looking at my notes right. Okay, so I see there's a question in the chat. Does someone want to read that to me?
I can read it, Commissioner.
Yeah.
Alex is asking to be clear. We are saying that we have 66% opt-out rate for infant toddler.
We're saying we have, no, we're saying that about 50% of families say they prefer a formal licensed childcare agreement, that there are a lot of folks relying on family. In some of our listening sessions, we hear from parents who are doing split shifts where one works one shift, one works the other. And it may just be for the first year or the second year. I mean, my guess is by the time they're 2-year-olds, it's way over 50%. But when you add in paid leave and the parent preference for informal or familial caregiving, the demand for infant toddler goes down. Now, we don't know that if infant toddler care were widely accessible and affordable, what that number would be. And we're really puzzling over that. But people can, you can raise your hands if you want during this period while we're taking questions. Meryl, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. I was just saying, that issue of people working split shifts and stuff, people do all sorts of things because they have to.
Exactly.
And if we had care that where families weren't paying 7% of their income, more than 7% of their income, probably we would see more uptake if there was available care. And we certainly wouldn't see as many families pulling their preschooler out of preschool when they have the second child, because now they can't afford to have, they're not working and they're paying for care.
Yes, I think that's a really good point. I appreciate that. Alex, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to get back to the numbers here because it
Sure.
does seem to mislead a little bit the issue. I mean, when we make it a gap that's so much smaller. So I'm understanding, we're saying our assumption is that 50%, we're saying only 50% of people who have infants and toddlers want care. So we're saying there's a 50% opt-out rate.
Yes, that's our assumption. I'm not saying, that based on some of the work of Bipartisan Policy Center and
Right.
some of our data about use, but, we are open to other ideas or other ways that we could get at this.
Yeah, that feels really high to me as an opt-out rate. And I just want to flag that and think we should look at, and I don't know where to find the right opt-out rate, but I think to Meryl's point, we're making assumptions based on what we have now. It's sort of like looking at market rate versus true cost of care. And like, if people had access, how many people would use it? And if it were affordable. So I don't know, that just.
Yeah, maybe we could, I'm just looking at Jen because she's been helping me with these, maybe we could look at what the opt-in rate is in Germany, where they have better funded infant toddler programs.
Commissioner, I think that Mark may be on the call and he's looked most closely at this, but we did look at other geographies. To Alex's point, like you do have to, understand what, and Meryl's point, you need to understand what demand would look like if care really was affordable and accessible and high quality. And what you see in those geographies is even at the in those places where all of those things are true, the uptake, particularly in the 0 to 1 age group, is relatively low. But then you still have to dig into that data too, because sometimes that's because there are policies in place that favor families staying at home, like extended parent leave and things like that. So that it is kind of messy when you dig into it, but would be happy to discuss further, Alex.
Yeah, really good feedback. And just the paid leave saves 8,000 infant toddler spaces, just having that for 12 weeks. So one thing the panel even thought about was if you extended leave longer, or you let parents share their weeks so that, because some parents take it and others don't, but if a couple could have, you know, those are other things we've looked at to try to ease this challenge for families of the early years in childcare. So we'll look again, and please, like, if you do research and find other places and ways we should be estimating this, we're really open to it, because these estimates really matter. That's what I was mean about, like, tonight, these numbers are sort of where the rubber meets the road. Other questions?
There's a couple, there's one in the Q&A, curious to know, and I know we're going to speak to this a little bit later on, but curious to know, does this account for children who will remain in the preschool programs with the new cutoff date for kindergarten?
Yes, that happened like in the midst of this, and I'll let, I'm not sure if Mark's on or Jen can speak to that, but we are really concerned about that, obviously.
It does include those families. It does include estimates of that, even though it doesn't take into effect until next year.
Okay. Okay, thanks. Are there other, you can raise your hand or put a question in the chat, and then we'll move on. Okay, we'll move to the next slide. Okay, now we want to move on to sort of the funding uses or potential investment needs. Before that, I want to give you some context for this. This funding and cost work group estimated incremental investments related to increased workforce compensation, access, and affordability based on recommendations from other work groups. So you can see the other work groups' recommendations here about increasing access and affordability, the workforce compensation and other work-related costs, and then some of the system investments that we'll be working on in the coming weeks. There are a variety of potential funding sources for these incremental investments, and this isn't all on the state. You know, there's federal, state, philanthropy, employers. We've been meeting with employers to pressure test things that they'd be willing to do for their employees and communities around childcare, and that's been an interest of the governors as well. So and also currently, most of the system is private. The state directly funds only a portion of providers. So these are some of our estimates of these investments. And again, they will be refined over time. Next slide. Okay. So these are, you know, based on feedback. I mean, we feel very clear that, you know, the top thing that folks are worried about is the workforce and compensation. That I think we've been saying clearly compensation comes first, and that's sort of the first thing we costed out. So what are the system costs for programs and for the state? So these are in millions. So if what we did was we used the proposed salary schedule that we sent to the legislature, and have figured in just about a 58% increase from the baseline system costs right now for family childcare and centers. So we have based on what we have in the workforce registry, you can see the first number, and the next number is system salary changes according to the salary schedule, and then also what would it cost to increase the benefits, and then proportional benefits for full-time employees, and then system-wide changes to full-time discretionary benefits. So you can sort of see how we did this. And the total compensation for all childcare and family childcare in the state would be $753 million. The one thing I'm wondering, Jen, if you can just clarify for me, is the current cost of FCCs and centers, the top number. Can you explain what that is? I just don't think I did a very good job.
I think you did a great job, but I'm happy to clarify. And anyone from the SVP team, feel free to jump in as well. But that's the baseline, using the baseline registry data that was in the narrow cost analysis. And then everything on top of that is incremental, related to increasing workforce compensation to the proposed mid-career levels, and also including a basic set of discretionary benefits to include health, dental, vision, life, and retirement benefits.
That was much better. Thank you. I think that helped everyone. All right, so slide 14, we're going to look at just state-funded programs and what would be the cost there. And you can see, using the same methodology, the work group looked at increasing slide 14, income eligibility. This one is the estimates of the workforce salary and benefit investment for state-funded programs. So the same thing as the previous slide, and the total is $97 million. The reason that says it may be offset by Care for Kids funding is that there's about $30 million going out to state-funded childcare programs in Care for Kids, in the form of Care for Kids payments, that are covering some of the full cost of quality now, but just for a small percentage of children. But there could be an offset there that would open up Care for Kids for the rest of more Care for Kids funding for the rest of the system, to up to about $30 million. So it's about 97 million. And then, so this is this. And then I started before to talk about Care for Kids, which is on the next slide. And then I will have a break for questions on these two. Next slide. Okay, so these are, I just talked about funds for, helping providers pay the full cost of quality. And again, keeping in mind that 70% of the system is totally private at this time, but there is up to 30% that is in the public system. But then all programs are able to access Care for Kids if they have families that have childcare subsidies. And we know these have been woefully underfunded, so that programs have been taking, 50% of the market rate or lower in Connecticut. So here are some ways to make care more affordable for families. So if you increased eligibility up to 70% of the state median income, that would cost about $7 million. Capping parent copays at 7% would cost about $3.4 million. The other thing that's come up that's an interesting new development is this idea of presumptive eligibility. For those of you that maybe aren't in the Care for Kids system, programs lose a lot of money, and parents are afraid to enroll their children because they might have a big bill, because they don't know if they're eligible for Care for Kids. This is a huge impact on family childcare providers and has an impact on every kind of provider. So the idea is to get the data systems in a place where the state would say, fill out this little temporary thing to see if you're likely to qualify. If you're likely to qualify, we are going to presume you eligible, and the state will pay for these spaces. And then it will, after a month, 2 months, 3 months, I think this is based on 3 months presumptive eligibility, the 11 million. If our data systems were in better shape, this number would go down. So if we could guarantee to do a 30-day turnaround, there'd be a presumptively eligible for 30 days, and then the state would pay, and if even if the family's not eligible. So we think that is something that came to us from really listening and from a panel member. And we think that is something that's a real problem for programs that we've heard about for years, and other states are doing this. The other is helping parents access application to increase folks using Care for Kids, which would increase these dollars out there for all programs. That would cost about 19 million. And then we have modeled a cost sharing pilot, tri-share, where businesses pay a third, the state pays a third, and parents pay a third, which would be for parents that make more money and work maybe in an area that's a childcare desert. So that's just something we've costed out to on the affordability range. Okay. Okay, so we wanted to share a couple of ideas in terms of increasing spaces. For the first time in, well, more than 30 years, we just went out with infant toddler spaces last year. We learned a lot. It was the first time we'd really gone out to RFP, if you will, for additional state funded spaces. And we have a lot of new programs who are part of the state system because of it, and other programs that have added in. And we also, the reason the governor and I focused on adding infant toddler spaces is we know that that's a real destabilizing part of the system. And I'm a real believer in pushing up early childhood, not pushing down elementary. I think it also sends a system that we're a sector. We are a different sector than the schools, even though the schools are part of the system. And so still the big challenge is infant and toddler spaces in the state. So we estimated how much it would cost to add 2,600 state-funded infant toddler spaces, and the cost of that would be $50 million. So that is that's a lot, but it would provide more care, and it would open up the system to more providers who are, hurting on their infant toddler spaces. The other option that we costed out was expanding Smart Start, which is a state program where the towns pay a portion and the state pays a portion for public school preschool classrooms. This is a tiny part of our system. When you just saw how many kids are in the system, more than 100,000. But in our research about Smart Start, we realized that they are in those classrooms is more than double the average number of children with special education needs. And in our parent survey, a huge problem for parents of children with special needs is that they cannot find a preschool option that allows them to work. And while school year is not ideal for parents of children with special needs, right now, most of them have the option of part week, part day, and it's really not working for them. They're hanging on by a thread to reach kindergarten when their kids will at least have a bus and a full school day and get the services they need on site versus, bringing kids in for itinerant services part-time. So we really thought that this was a way to encourage schools to move away from the part day special education classroom, part week, part day, and move toward a full day school year special education classroom. So this is something in terms of access was one of the biggest issues that came up for families, and this seemed like a way to help with that problem because of the way some school districts, these classrooms are 50% children with special needs, but the average is 28%, well above that. So this is a way to increase preschool spaces at a lower rate and also help families of children with special needs. Just want to make sure I covered all my points. And it may be a little less than 1,900 spaces. It's somewhere between 1,500 and 1,900. We're working that out because some of our estimates are based on some ARPA temporarily funded classrooms. So it might not go up as much as 1,900 when we remove the temporarily funded classrooms. But we think it's a way to really help children with special needs. Okay, I'm going to stop and take questions again here. Does anyone, are there any hands out or Q&A?
There was a question in the chat by Meryl as far as the what's the estimate for increased participation if eligibility went up to 70% SMI for Care for Kids, and Kristen answered it by roughly about 600 families the first year it would increase. And I don't see.
There are some other questions in the chat, in the regular chat, not in the Q&A.
Okay.
There is one, it said from Sean, it says it's the 7% parent copay based on adjusted gross income from the previous year tax returns. I'm happy to help answer that one if.
Yes, Kristen, that would be wonderful.
It is based on the gross income. The only time that the tax returns or adjusted gross income would be taken into account is for a self-employed parent.
Okay. And then Kim is saying leaning on school boards to invest is a risky endeavor. There's a lot of politics and we all have seen what's happening in Norwich. I think we've been able to stabilize that and save those spaces. But yes, and I mean, I think the whole issue here is the non-system makes the whole system somewhat risky. I'm sorry, I keep looking this way because that's where I have you all, but you all, I need to look this way. So you all think I'm looking at you, which I really am. So I think, you know, we're aware of that, but I mean, I think we have to understand that almost half of the system, 15,000 kids are in public schools right now for 3 and 4-year-olds. It already is a big part of the system. And we want to think of ways to stabilize that. And I think offering state incentives could help stabilize it. And I think we've got to, you know, focus in alliance districts as well as we think about this when we think about the public schools. And I think right now Smart Start is targeted in that way. The towns have to have at least one Title I school to get Smart Start. Meryl, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just the Care for Kids estimated uptake if you increased eligibility. It just seemed like those numbers were pretty small considering the increase in your caseload during the pandemic. You know, I know the governor out there talking about free childcare certainly helped to get people aware of the program and, you know, applying, but it still seems like 600 more kids if you go up to 70% of SMI seems kind of low.
It did to us too. And so we are checking that. We will check it again, but I mean, we feel pretty confident that that's what it would be. And I will say during the pandemic, when we estimated with the same process, we actually overestimated, but we think that's part of the last problem, that we're not doing a good enough job letting families know this benefit's available and trying to help them reduce the rejection rate. And we're in the midst of a parent portal too, which is going to make it even easier for parents to both apply and track. We have to make this so much easier for families. I think I'm all for increasing SMI, but if we increase SMI without having a recommendation around increasing awareness and access, I think they'll just fight against each other. So we really think we need to lean on that.
And the Courtney put in 21% of families eligible to receiving subsidies. I thought it was 12. Is it? Do we have?
I think nationally it's 12. I think
Okay.
we're a little higher. Isn't that right, Julie? Because I've used the number 12 before, and that's national. But when we dug in, again, this work group really dug into some of these numbers. It's Julie, can you just confirm that?
Yes, yep, you are right, Commissioner.
Okay.
I have two clarifying questions.
Yeah.
And I realized that I jumped in last time without sharing appreciation for all of you, and I should have started with that. So thank you all for doing this work and bringing us along, and for our input. 26,000, I asked in the chat, when you talk about 26,000 slots and 50 million, is it a direct math equation there to figure out how much per slot, or are there, you mentioned fit out costs, so I didn't know if that was included in the 50 million.
Yeah.
So like how much per
Jen or
slot?
Mark, do you want to just talk, or Michael? I don't know who did this equation exactly, but
Michael put something in the chat, but I just wasn't sure if it was correct.
It was
Right.
actually
just-
an internal calculation based on the, just doubling the current budgets for the contracted slots program.
So, okay, I'm sorry, you have to tell me later, Jen, what the number is, because I don't know how to do that. And then the other question I had was, you mentioned the capping the parent fee at 7%, which I think is a fantastic place for us to try to go as a state. How is that loss of revenue offset for the provider? Like, and how do we recoup that?
do you know, Alex, it is such a complicated equation. I'm so glad you asked that, because every time I think we totally understand Care for Kids, we implement a change and it doesn't affect people the way we think it will. So I think Julie and Kristen, I know you've run scenarios and maybe can explain that, but I think we should be able to sort of demonstrate that, maybe even for the panel, just to show how this all plays out and who gains and who wins when you go to 7%. I don't know if you have any initial comments. No.
Now, I think what we can do, though, Commissioner, maybe is come up with one or two scenarios that we can present to the panel that might show kind of the offsets and who gains where, if that would be.
Right. And I think there's a real question. I know I keep coming back and saying, oh, do it at 10%, because to me, it's like, it's not enough money in the system, and 10% for a family right now would seem like a dream. And then I get pushback that's real from people like the vice president that say we're moving all states to no more than 7% of parent fees. So I hate to set us up for something that ACF, which is the Administration for Children and Families, is just going to change on us. But I think to Alex's question, we have to run the scenario and make sure that it's doesn't have a negative impact on the bottom line for providers when you reduce the parent fee.
Well, it absolutely will. The question is, where do you get the money to?
Well, but how do you fill in? Like,
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah. Should we look at rates, et cetera, to fill in? Yeah. Okay. I think that looks like the questions. Am I missing any before we shift? Because I'm going to go over couple more before breakout groups, and then we really want to get a good bit of time in the breakout group so you all can have conversations as well. The questions were super helpful as we head into the breakout sessions, because they will reduce the questions in there. And as I said, each breakout session is going to have someone there. Okay, slide 17, Jen. Okay, so I just got to move all my pictures again. We know that this is an investment worth making, and we're going to make that recommendation to the Blue Ribbon panel. And this equitable funding for accessible, affordable, high quality system for Connecticut families and children is super important. And a 13% return on investment, there's really not much better investments a government can make. So the work group's recommendations are to commit to funding the investments needed to address core challenges in the workforce compensation, affordability, and access in systems. In terms of maximizing federal, local resources, the work group recommends that we support the system's recommendation to develop a more flexible and responsive system, that we match supply and demand better, that we leverage the early childhood cabinet to focus on children to systemically identify cross-agency collaborations, similar to the workforce cabinet, that we better leverage the Head Start partnership to braid and blend and layer, and that we grow our partnership with SDE to look for ways, IDEA Part B is located in public schools. Title I services, a lot of states, Title I is used to expand preschool. So how do we grow that? And then this idea of community needs assessment that's common and supporting local governance. Connecticut is a town of local control. It's the way it is. It doesn't mean there can't be regional efficiencies in terms of, coming up with regional plans, because not every town has a council that's able to make recommendations in the same way, but to systemically identify local assets that can be used. And we've seen some communities do this. So we want to really hold them up as examples. And then in terms of new or incremental funding sources, next slide, Jen. Ultimately, state leaders need to identify which funding sources are best suited for Connecticut. There are a host of examples to consider from other geographies, and we'll be bringing those forward to the Blue Ribbon panel. And also, we believe that business and philanthropy can play a role. So we've made these recommendations for funding strategies. So the first one is to bring state leaders and stakeholders together to identify promising ECE funding sources and mechanism, building on examples from other places like New Mexico, Vermont, Washington, DC. There are a lot of different models right now, California, for how to fund early childhood. I will say, because I haven't said it out loud, but we know this is going to be a mixed model. That is how we're going to be in Connecticut. People are going to want individual choices. Family need different choices, and we need to make sure those are available to them. School day, school year might work for some, but it doesn't work for most working families. And so we've got to keep that in mind and look at how other geographies have dealt with those challenges. And you'll note, since I've been commissioner, the call has not been UPK, let's push down and bring all the 4-year-olds in. That just doesn't work for the early childhood system. That's why we started with incremental investments in infants and toddlers. We've been really grateful to CBIA. They have been at the table with us, meeting with business. We want to continue that and assess business interests and ideas for sources of funding and cost sharing. And we were in Eastern Connecticut, and those employers are anxious for pilots and ideas. They're like anything. We need anything to help us with the childcare problem out there, and our data certainly supports that. And then develop models for using the Early Childhood Ed Fund, and that was established in the legislature, and do philanthropic funding. So now we're going to transition into breakout groups. You're just going to join your breakout group and have a chance for about 20 minutes of conversation. And then we'll come back to the main room. So we'll see you soon. I'm going to stay in this breakout room myself.
Yes. All right. Starting it now. Just give that a minute.
Do you select for us?
Yep.
Okay.
Tried my best to divide it up a little bit.
Thanks, Eloisa. Okay, I'm just going to leave it open because just want your questions and comments and thoughts. I'm sorry it took longer than I thought it would for that first section, but we did get to some questions there, which was actually really helpful. Just raise your hand.
I'll just say
Yeah.
something.
There we go.
Callie? Is it
Hi, my
Callie?
name is Callie Snively. I'm new to Connecticut and I'm also a new mother. So
Welcome.
thank you. I'm learning about all of the wonderful things of childcare and kind of starting to understand all the costs associated with everything. I've been putting some comments in the chat. I'm by no means an expert, so I'm sorry, I'm probably one of the more naive individuals in this group, but I'll just throw it out there. It seems like, Beth, that there's a ton of weight on kind of correctly or approximating to the best of everyone's knowledge, knowing data limitations on demand and supply. And it seems like there's different things that have been kind of brought to the attention that there might be some underclubbing or under approximation of IT demand. And as I know, as I'm just looking into different options in my local area, in the Riverside area, that I'm already struggling to find care for twos, and my baby is 8 months. And so I definitely don't know all the options, but I think I'm just raising that I see danger in under approximating this, given the weight number holds for the kind of policy going forward.
So danger in under approximating, and also the need for better matching so you can more easily find what's available. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Welcome to Connecticut and to Greenwich.
Thank you.
The other thing, Commissioner, I would just point out on the infant toddler is the issue isn't only kind of the question about kind of how large demand is. The issue also is the supply. Today we have a shortage of around 15,000 slots if you kind of count all of the towns with shortages. And regardless of whether demand is 50% or ultimately 60%, if we can make it as affordable as Canada, the issue is that, and this is the issue not just in Connecticut, but throughout the United States, there's a lack of infant toddler slots. That's what we have to really work on first and foremost.
Yeah, and one thing that keeps getting shortchanged in these conversations, there's a lack of slots, but then we know that these young children with these vulnerable brains are not having a high quality, consistent experience, because we know that almost 70% of families have both parents working. So, we want in those early years, it's so important for the brain development. Okay, who else has something to ask or add? This is not like y'all. We have a lot of folks here who are often quite lively. You can just speak out rather than raise your hand, because I can't always see raised hands. Anything about the estimates or some of the ideas for expanding access, or do you have other ideas for expanding access based on your experience? I'm trying my best high school teacher pause, but what would you change here? What did we presented? We don't have all the answers. This is like preliminary. So we're really want to know what you're thinking. I know you're thinking things, some of you. I'm not going to trying not to call on people. Any family providers on the call who want to weigh in?
I know there's a lot of family providers. I see them.
Okay. So it's so perfect. I guess we really got it perfect. I know that's not true. Thank you, Maria. Bail me out here.
Comisionada, buenas tardes.
Buenas
Perdón,
tardes.
entré muy tarde, no entendí el concepto de lo que se dio en esos diagramas que presentaron, pero quisiera, o sea, referirme a las situaciones cuando se hace esto, los fondos de expansión o de la manera como se distribuye. Vemos que, por ejemplo, en los sitios más vulnerables, donde se necesitan más proveedoras de cuidado infantil o educadoras, no se dan mucho esos fondos para ese lado. Como explicó esta mamá inicialmente, que es de Greenwich, creo que explicó esta mamá que está aquí en la reunión, que ella no tiene, o sea, no hay. Entonces, esa disparidad que hay de los cuidados infantiles, hay en pueblitos que hay 2 o 3 y no los hay, y la necesidad de las familias es muy amplia. Entonces, a veces hay 3, 4, 5, 6 cuidados infantiles en un mismo bloque. Entonces, ¿cómo, o sea, creamos esa disparidad a que se localice estratégicamente?
Maria, un momento. I'm going to
I
ask
think-
Eloisa if you can just summarize some of that for us.
So I was only able to listen to some of it because I was trying to figure it out. I think the English interpretation was in the Spanish channel.
Yeah,
and
my
that's-
English, we have translation live, but it's okay. It didn't work perfectly. I got some of it. Elena, did you get?
Yeah, 'cause I was trying to figure it
help out a
That's
little
what-
bit. Hola, Maria. Yeah, so she was talking, about the disparities in funding. And when you look at high vulnerable communities or communities with, what we call childcare deserts. So she was saying maybe there's only 1 or 2 providers in a community, but then you have other communities that have, a multitude or many more providers. And so how do we really, with new funding, how do we disperse that funding in an equitable way so that those providers who really need it and the families who really need it can find the care because they have more spaces now?
Okay,
¿Sí, María? ¿Está bien?
Sí, Elena, thank you.
I want to be sure with Sasha that now we are translating for Maria in our answer. See? Okay. Thank you, Maria. Really great question. And what we have done is we have sort of looked at every town in Connecticut and what the licensed, we are using licensed capacity as our number. And there are huge disparities. We have some towns with 80% supply for infant toddlers. Maybe that's a little high, 70% supply. Mark, yeah, 60% supply. But then we have some with 20% supply. And we have some with 130% supply for preschools and others with 60% supply. So we are looking town by town. And it wasn't here today, but I believe by the time we get to our final recommendations, the investments will be recommended to target communities that have these disparities with supply and demand. At least at first, that's where we're likely to start. It's a big problem in Connecticut. But thank you for asking that question. It gave us a chance to make that point.
Otro punto más, comisionada, bueno, es referente de que qué va a pasar ahora que en septiembre de este año se terminan los fondos de expansión, ¿verdad? Los fondos de ALPA. Entonces, sabemos de que el sueldo, el promedio básico del sueldo mínimo aquí en el estado fluctúa entre los 14, 15 dólares, pero es imposible que digamos que nosotras vamos a alcanzar ese nivel, pero ha contemplado el gobernador, la oficina de educación temprana que usted lo dirige, en cuanto a que quizás se dé estos incentivos a futuro en el 2024 de una manera que quizás 1 o 2
Okay, Elena?
Great.
para
So she's
poder, o sea,
asking,
mantener digamos, el sistema favorable, porque realmente todas nos hemos mantenido y seguimos manteniendo, hemos estado diciendo como que hemos respirado tranquilas, sin la preocupación de que, a pesar de que con las cantidades mínimas o máximas de niños, pero esto nos ha permitido tener un personal estable adicional en estos programas.
Yep. So, couple of things. So specifically with the infant toddler expansion spaces, right, it's been stated that they're ending at the end of this fiscal year. And so what are the plans for that? But kind of in the context of the larger conversation, there have been incentives and support to pay the minimum wage of substitutes or other personnel to let the providers breathe a little bit more calmly and to be able to offer their services now during the pandemic and coming out. And we know that those are ending. And so how have you talked with the governor? Has the OEC been thinking about how do we keep those going to maintain the stability of the providers?
Yes, thank you, Maria. I think the Blue Ribbon panel needs to consider those things, and the infant toddler spaces, the hope is to continue those. They'll remain infant toddler spaces. They won't turn into preschool spaces, which is not the perfect situation. But that's the plan right now that we're open to discuss.
Gracias, comisionada, y también quiero agradecerle aquí en el panel por lo que ha hecho con esto de los fondos de expansión de CDC a través de la ciudad de Hartford, de podernos haber dado las facilidades para poder acceder, y realmente aprecio mucho lo que usted ha hecho y lo que la OEC está haciendo.
Yeah, de nada. And
Did you get that one?
well, I
Very grateful and thank you.
you're saying thank you for helping with the problem with the insurance with the city of Hartford. Is that
Well,
correct?
that and with supporting just the expansion of infants and toddlers in the city of Hartford as well.
Yes.
And just thank you for all that you're doing.
You're welcome. For those of you that are maybe don't have the 360 here, when OEC went out to bid with infant and toddler spaces for the first time ever, the state funded spaces were open up to family childcare programs to be a part of that system. And so we're still working out some kinks, and we want to make it better. But we are grateful for those of you like Maria, who is also, by the way, the Family Childcare Provider of the Year for the United States. That we need to do better. Yeah, and you help us. Your willingness to speak up helps us be better and consider family childcare. It's such an important part of the system. Okay, we have about 4 more minutes. Did Maria inspire some of you to speak up?
This is so rare.
It is rare, but I think there's so much to digest that people are taking it in, and it's complicated, and part of our job is to simplify this going forward, but we wanted to bring you what we had. Rhonda, I knew I could count on you.
Commissioner, I just want to give a time check. We have about 2 more minutes.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I was running around and I said, I got to sit down. I think it's going to be over soon. So I have to speak up and say a little bit. Mine is in regard to care for kids.
Yeah,
I'm getting phone calls from providers that have put in and requested the information for the children that need special needs.
yeah,
And what's happening is the paperwork has all been submitted.
yeah,
It was submitted almost since the beginning of June. And when I got in touch with my liaison, the problem is they're working overtime trying to catch up. My parent doesn't know what she should do. She thinks that she's missing information, and I don't know what to tell her.
well, Rhonda, I'm happy to help your parent if you reach out to me, but it sounds like we have more of a systemic challenge that we need to address because we have this special compensation for caring for children with special needs to try to improve access for families. And if that system doesn't work, we're actually reducing access when you just, so, you know, Mark and team, we might want to add to our that special needs access challenge, assuring that Care for Kids reimbursement system for families of children with special needs is not too much of a burden for providers and families. So that's really helpful, Rhonda.
And also what's happening is that now the parents, when we're submitting the paperwork, because they only have one fax number that all of this goes into a mail room, they're losing the paperwork. So if you're sending a cover sheet in and you say that I attached 1 to 7 items, they tell me weeks later, they're telling the parents, oh, well, the reason we haven't done anything is because you're missing page 2 and 5.
Yeah.
Well, you're not telling anybody that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And it looks like everybody's coming back into the main room, which we stayed in.
Okay.
But for those of you that just joined us, the fact that you just heard Rhonda say the word fax will help you understand how much this system is in need of improvement. We have made a lot of improvements with the Parent Portal 1, and Parent Portal 2 is coming, and in August, OEC 360 is launching, so people don't have to go 5 places at OEC. But I think for tonight, the focus is on how do we improve the technology system so families and providers can match up and can get these problems solved more easily. So it encourages more providers to be part of the state-funded system, so that as we increase access, parents have access to more care. Anyway, some of you are just back. We talked in our group about making sure that we consider disparities across the state in access to care, and especially with infant toddler slots, and making sure that the state takes into account, or the Blue Ribbon panel takes into account, that some of the pandemic era funds are going away and providers have relied on some of those funds, and some, I'll say politely, inefficiencies in our current Care for Kids system. So I'll stop there. Other groups want to share any summaries?
I think one of the big takeaways from our group was, are we looking to revamp the system based on what we currently have, or are we looking to build a system for what we want it to be?
Excellent points. And I think we have to really take that into account and bring that to the panel's attention on Thursday, that was a question tonight. Thank you for that. What about the third room? Is that you, Kristen?
It was me. We had a question come up regarding the increase in the SMI, again, to the 70% SMI, and wondering how that data kind of came to be, whether that was used based on applications that came in that were denied. Is that how we came to that 600 number? Just a little bit more context around the data for that estimate. And then there was a really great suggestion, and you know, Courtney and Meg, please feel free to chime in for anything that I might not get 100% right here. But as we're thinking about the collaborations with specifically SDE and like grade 3 assessments and tracking, you know, those children from infant toddler through grade 3, and how we can, you know, think that through as we're thinking about our data system. And I think those were kind of the two big things. We talked a lot about data and improving that system as well.
That's great. And as you talk about that infant toddler through grade 3, you know, we haven't talked much at all about after school care. And I know I got a form today that talked about the challenges working families were facing with after school care. And, you know, maybe we need to pay a little more attention there. Well, I will say my room was eerily quiet. I'm used to more coming in, and I think it's a sign of just how much information we're processing. And, you know, you're responding in many ways to data versus, you know, specific programs or recommendations. But you probably have to sit with this and think about this. So I'm going to ask Eloisa to drop the link for the feedback form in the chat. Because we still want more feedback if you process here and think about it. I really want to thank the team. I know Nabiu and Michael and Mark and Jen, who've spent endless hours in analytics with our imperfect data, trying to come up with the best possible. And then tonight, I think we got some more good recommendations. We can go back and do further analysis. So we'll be keeping this feedback and continue to update you. Don't expect it to change before the panel meeting, because we bring you what we bring the panel, but everything is changing and with the feedback. So I think you'll see your feedback incorporated as we go forward. A couple people have thanked me tonight. That's ridiculous. You are still at work and you've been with children all day, so many of you, and some of you have children tonight. And we owe you such a debt of gratitude, because you've been doing this work in a system that doesn't have appropriate funding, doesn't have appropriate connection with families and programs. You do this work for families in your community and are helping hold up our state's economy. But even more important, you are child by child changing the world and helping them be ready for school, ready to be community members. Just so grateful for what you do every day. And then on top of that, to come out tonight is beyond. So maybe you were quiet because you're darn tired from working all day. But look at the form, give us feedback. We so appreciate you. I appreciate Team OEC. A lot of hours went into this. Like I see Dewani, who's been improving our technology systems over the past 6 months, and we'll be seeing that soon, but we know we can do better, and we're going to continue to strive to do better. So have a great night, and thanks for what you do. Go USA, 3 a.m. tomorrow. We can do it. Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Oh, and Jamaica. Don't forget, yay, Jamaica. We got Connecticut on Jamaica.